Good afternoon. My name is Javier Montes, and I'm going to present the goal number 16 of the SDGs: peace, justice, and strong institutions. First of all, we have to take into consideration what are the SDGs and what is their objective, what is their aim. So, the SDGs' aim is to significantly reduce all forms of violence and work with governments and communities to end conflicts and insecurity. Promoting the rule of law and human rights are key to this process, and as is reducing the flow of illicit arms and strengthening the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance. To just show a little bit of our index, we are going to talk about what is this SDG about, how it is measured, and what kind of progress has been made. Okay, so our SDG is Goal 16, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So why is this a goal for the United Nations? Because to start with, some regions enjoy peace, security, and prosperity, while others fall into endless cycles of conflicts and violence. This is not inevitable and must be addressed. We cannot hope for sustainable development without peace, stability, human rights, and effective governance based on the rule of law. Yet our world is increasingly divided. Armed violence and insecurity have a destructive impact on a country's development, affecting economic growth and often resulting in grievances that last for generations. To take into consideration, as of today, we have 68.5 million people by the end of 2017 that have been forcibly displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, or human rights violations. And 1 billion people are legally invisible because they cannot prove who they are. This includes an estimated 625 million children under 14 years of age whose births were never registered. Moreover, sexual violence, crime, exploitation, and torture are also prevalent where there is conflict or no rule of law. And countries must take measures to protect those who are most at risk. So, advances in ending violence, promoting the rule of law, strengthening institutions, and increasing access to justice are uneven and continue to deprive millions of their security, rights, and opportunities, and undermine the delivery of public services and broader economic development. Attacks on civil society are also holding back development progress. Renewed efforts are essential to move towards the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal number 16. Realizing the goal of peaceful, just, and inclusive societies is still a long way off. In recent years, no substantial advances have been made towards ending violence, promoting the rule of law, strengthening institutions at all levels, or increasing access to justice. Millions of people have been deprived of their security, rights, opportunities, while attacks on human rights activists and journalists are holding back development. More countries are ramping up efforts to uncover human rights abuses and designing laws and regulations that foster more open and just societies. But much more work is needed to ensure that these mechanisms are implemented properly. So now we're going to explain how this SDG is measured and each component of this SDG. Okay, so here comes the big question. How do we measure the advance of this SDG? Okay, so the general progress in this SDG is measured based on targets, and each target has associated indicators that measure progress on this specific target. Okay, so without further ado, let's analyze our first target. This target is aimed to its goal is to significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. It is measured by 4 separated indicators. The first indicator will be to analyze the number of intentional homicides. The second indicator will be to measure the prevalence of armed conflicts and their impacts in terms of loss of life. Together with the first indicator on intentional homicide, they measure violent deaths that occur in all countries of the world. intentional homicides, and in situations of armed conflict-related deaths. The third indicator would be to measure the total number of persons who have been victims of physical, psychological, or sexual violence in the previous 12 months as a share of the total population. And indicator number 4 refers to the proportion of the population, adults in this case, who feel safe walking alone in the neighborhood. So, the second target would be to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children, which is measured by 3 separated indicators. The first one would be the proportion of children aged 1 to 17 years who have experienced any physical punishment and or psychological aggression by caregivers in the past month. The second indicator would be to measure the number of victims of human trafficking per 100,000 population, distinguished by sex, age, and form of exploitation. This indicator is defined as the ratio between the total number of victims of trafficking in persons detected or living in the country and the population resident in the country, expressed by 100,000 population. And finally, the third one would be the proportion of young women and men aged 18 to 29 years who have experienced sexual violence by age 18. Okay, so the third target is to promote the rule of law and at the national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. It is measured by 2 separate indicators. First indicator measures the number of victims of violent crime in the previous 12 months who reported the victimization to competent authorities and other officially recognized conflict resolution mechanisms as a percentage of all victims of violent crime in the previous 12 months. In other words, it measures the confidence on the authorities. The second indicator measures the total number of persons held in detention who have not yet been sentenced as a percentage of the total number of persons held in detention. So the fourth target would be to accomplish by 2030 significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flows, strengthen the recovery and return of our stolen assets, and combat all forms of organized crime. And it is measured by 2 separate indicators. The first one would be the total value of inward and outward illicit financial flows in current United States dollars. This indicator measures the total value of inward and outward illicit financial flows, also called IFFs, in current United States dollars. These are financial flows that are illicitly generated, for example, originated in criminal activities or tax evasion, or illicitly transferred, for example, violating currency controls, or illicitly used, for example, financing terrorism. And the second target indicator, would be the proportion of seized, found or surrendered arms, weapons whose illicit origin or context has been traced or established by a competent authority, in line with international instruments. Basically, that's the point, is to reduce all illicit financial and weapons flows recovered from fighting organized crime and fighting every sort of financial crime. Okay, so we arrived to the fifth target, which goal is to substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. The first indicator is defined as the percentage of persons who paid at least one bribe, in meaning giving a public official money, a gift, or a counter favor. So a public official or were asked for a bribe by these public officials in the last 12 months, as a percentage of persons who had at least one contact with a public official in the same period. The second indicator refers to the proportion of firms asked for a gift or informal payment when meeting with tax officials. The sixth indicator will be to develop effective, accountable and transparent institutions at all levels, and it is measured also by 2 separate indicators. The first one would be to measure the primary government expenditures as a proportion of original approved budget by sector or by budget codes or similar. What does it mean? It means that primary government expenditures is a proportion of the original approved budget, and this indicator measures the extent to which aggregate budget expenditure outturn reflects the amount originally approved as defined in government budget documentation and fiscal reports, for example, the Presupuestos Generales del Estado in Spain. The coverage is budgetary central government, BCG, and the time period covered is the last 3 completed fiscal years. The second indicator is the proportion of the population satisfied with the last experience of public services. What this indicator measures is the levels of public satisfaction with people's last experience with public services in the 3 service areas of healthcare, education, and government services. This is a survey-based indicator which emphasizes citizens' experiences over general perceptions with an eye on measuring the availability and quality of the services as they were actually delivered to survey respondents. Respondents are asked to reflect on the last experience with its service, and to provide a rating on 5 attributes or service-specific standards of healthcare, education, and government specifics such as access, affordability, quality of facilities, etc., etc. And the final question is to ask respondents for their overall satisfaction level with each service. While disaggregation dimensions is not specified by the indicator, it is recommended that survey results at a minimum be disaggregated by sex, income, and place of residence. To the extent possible, all efforts should be made to also disaggregate results by disability status and by nationally relevant population groups. Okay. So, the 7th target aims to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions and social services. The first subcomponent of this indicator aims to measure how representative of the general population are the individuals occupying key decision-making positions in national legislatures. The second subcomponent would be the proportional representation of various demographic groups: women, youth, persons with disability, and national relevant population groups in bureaucratic positions. Finally, the last subcomponent of the first indicator aims to measure how representative of the general population are the individuals occupying 2 key decision-making positions in the judiciary. And the second indicator would be measuring the self-reported levels of external political efficiency, survey-based, meaning the extent to which people think that politicians and all political institutions will listen to and act on the opinions of ordinary citizens. The 8th target would be to broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance, and it is measured by one single indicator, which is the voting rights of developing countries in international institutions, the proportion of members, So this indicator has 2 components: the developing country proportion of voting rights and the developing country proportion of membership in international organizations. In some institutions, these 2 components are identical. This indicator is calculated independently for 11 different international institutions: United Nations General Assembly, United Nations Security Council, United Nations Economic and Social Council, the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Finance Corporation, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the Financial Stability Board. 9th target would be to provide legal identity for all, including birth registration, by 2030. The only indicator that measures this goal measures the proportion of children under 5 years of age whose births have been registered with a civil authority. And thus we arrive to the last target, which is to ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national registration and international agreements, which is measured by 2 separate indicators. first one would be to register or to survey the number of verified cases of killing, kidnapping, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention and torture of journalists, associated media personnel, trade unionists and human rights advocates in the previous 12 months. The second indicator would be to count the number of countries that adopt and implement constitutional, statutory and/or policy guarantees for public access to information. The focus of this indicator is thus on the status of adoption and implementation on constitutional, statutory and policy guarantees for public access to information. The definition relates directly to public access to information, which is wider than, but it's also very much based upon the established fundamental freedoms of expression and association. Conversely, these freedoms have also both impacts on the environment to public access to information.
Well, now I'm going to talk a little about what kind of progress has been made in this topic in the last few years. First of all, we're going to talk about international homicides. Mainly, we can say that it has been stable around 6% for the last decade. Evolution is due mainly to improvement in accuracy of data, showing a really big range of values in 2008 and a smaller one in 2015. 8 out of 10 children have suffered violence in any moment of their lives. These data come from developing countries, that's why it is so big, but in Northern Africa, this data increased to 9 out of 10 children. We can say few about sexual violence on child. This is mainly because we have a small data in which we can trust on this topic. All we can say is that values are ranged between 0 and 16% and that women suffer more this thing than men. Moving forward to the next topic, we can say that from a peak in 2011, human traffic is diminishing in absolute terms. We can observe that mainly women are victims of this traffic. Children are a minority, but an important one. We're talking that around 30% of victims are under 18 years old. Let's talk now about unsentenced detainees. We see a slight improvement of 2% in this topic, from 32% at the beginning of the decade to 30% nowadays. There's room for improvement still, because in Southern Asia, values are double of those of the rest of the world. There are a lot of victims of robbery in nowadays world, but the important point is if victims report these issues to authorities. We found an important gap between high-income and lower-income people within the same country, due mainly because lack of trust in authorities. Another important subject is the presence of bribery. 18% of firms globally report receiving bribery. There is a big gap here too, because this number is almost a quarter in low-income countries, while it is close to 0 in high-income ones. Since last century, there has been a constant increase in countries having human rights institutions. Almost half of the countries have them. However, a lot of them lack effective defense of human rights. Data in this point increased from 35.5% to 37%. The registration of children under 5 years old has remained constant for the last 5 years. We're talking about a 73% of the children globally being registered. This number is much smaller in some parts of the world, such as the sub-Saharan Africa, where not even the half of the children are registered. In some areas, like urban ones, it's much likely to find registered children. 1.5 more times more likely is this thing in urban areas. Obviously, the richest part of the population have highest rates. The next slide talks about the right to access information. This is a problematic issue. Each year, around 350 government workers are killed just for work in this area. Many countries, 125, have adopted laws regulating this right. However, only 40 of them defend it effectively. Finally, we're going to talk about the deviation in budget. This problem affects all types of regions independently of their income. We're talking about 33% of worldwide countries deviating more than 10%. 15% deviate more than 50%. The region showing more improvement is the Eastern Asia and the Pacific. And this is all for today. Thanks for your attention.